All right, so good morning, everybody. Welcome everyone to the 7th Annual Canadian Global Health Students and Young Professionals Summit. This is the first year that we're running this summit virtually, and we're so excited to have you here. This is 8 months in the making, and we're so excited to bring this day to you. My name is Sabina, and I am going to be moderating this session. And I joined the GHSYPS 2020 Planning Committee as the Partnerships Co-Lead. Behind the scenes, I have the lovely Dan Dillett. He's going to be providing all the tech support for today. So feel free to put in the chat if you need any help. Just as a land acknowledgement, I am moderating today from the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit Territory. Land acknowledgement information will be provided in the chat for later. Before I hand it off to our lovely speakers for today, I do have to cover some housekeeping items. For those tuning in live, closed captioning is available in English. To access this feature, you can click the closed caption button on the Zoom panel at the bottom of your page. Also, please note that this session is going to be recorded and made available on our website at ghsips.ca following the summit. So if you feel like you missed anything and you want to go over anything, feel free to head over to that website later. We also ask for all of our attendees to remain on mute unless you are called to speak. And also we will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the session. So feel free to leave any questions in the chat or hold on to them until the very end. We will get back to them at some point. Another thing that we need to mention is the code of conduct for today's summit. In the interest of fostering an inclusive and collaborative space, we have developed a code of conduct, and that document is going to be linked in the chat. And just a reminder that any of the information that's shared in the chat is viewable by all attendees. So please be respectful of the shared space. And without further ado, I am going to send it over to our lovely speakers for today.
Thank you, Sabina. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Dendys. I'm the Executive Director of Results Canada. I want to welcome you to this session, this Advocacy Bootcamp, and really looking forward to the next hour that we get to spend with you all. I'm going to introduce my amazing team. Amelia Monstad is a campaigns officer with Results. You can see her smiling face in the images there. And Lindsay Sheridan is our Parliamentary Officer. And we also have another member of our team, Dr. Robin Waite, who is a manager with our team. And I think there's a few people on the call, Nina for one, who is a results volunteer, and we'll get to that in a minute, but just wanted to welcome her and welcome all of you. So we're going to spend the next hour really digging into advocacy. Results is a grassroots advocacy organization. Our mission is to create the political will to end extreme poverty, recognizing that that is a very big mission, and the journey to get to the world that we want to create is a long one, but we advocate around the steps to get there, recognizing and prioritizing hope, solutions, and action as an antidote or a vaccine against despair. So we have two parts to our mission. One is to create the political will to end poverty. The other is to empower individuals to see that they can make a difference, to see that you can make a difference through advocacy. And that's what this boot camp, this session, this training is all about. Next slide, please, Sabina. So as I said, we just introduced, that's the team there on the right. We were in Washington participating in a conference and doing some meetings, but we're going to dig into the session now. Next slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Amelia.
Great, thanks. So yeah, just a couple things we'll be talking about today. We'll start with a little icebreaker, so get ready to enter your name in the chat. We'll talk about advocacy, specifically parliamentary advocacy. Chris has got a great example of some advocacy we've done around the Accelerator for those who know what that is. And then there'll be time for questions at the end. Next slide. Thanks. So to start, we won't be speaking out loud, but if you want to just type into the chat, we'd love to hear your names or see your names and hear about a time if you could describe when you were involved in making a change that made you feel powerful. So if you want to just type that into everyone, and we'll see who's online. We'll give you 30 seconds for that. Sabina, I think the slides might have jumped ahead. Yeah, there we go, thanks. So while a few come in, I'll just read one or two out so we can see who's here. So Robin's so great to share. She says, I felt powerful when I worked in my community to change and stop a development project that was in breach of planning policy. The build went ahead, but with our community taking action, we managed to make sure some critical protective measures were put into place. Sounds like some important work. And Nardine, a second-year med student at McGill, says that they participated in a project that gave a voice to community health workers. So I think everyone can think of those examples when you contributed to something important. So next slide, please. Thanks for introducing yourselves. We'll get going. So what is advocacy? So it could be defined as conducting actions to influence decision makers with the goal of bringing about specific changes. So you can advocate for all kinds of different things, ideally something that you're passionate about, and we'll dive a little deeper into this. Next slide, Sabina. Great. So I think sometimes there's some confusion around the difference between advocacy and activism. So we'll just unpack those a little bit. Advocacy could be considered sort of working within the system. There's a real focus on relationship building and trying to bring about specific policy changes. Whereas activism, one might think of it as being outside of the system. And sometimes this is necessary if you don't have direct communication, the possibility of directly communicating with decision makers. Both are important, they are different, and depending on the issue and the political context, one may work better than the other. And just a note about lobbying. So all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. So it has a particular definition and meaning. It's different in different parts of the world. So if you want to know more about lobbying specifically, you could read about that online. It often gets this kind of negative connotation, but lobbying is not negative. You can, try to influence legislation, and that could be for the common good or for private interests, but it's not inherently a negative thing. But again, different from advocacy and activism. So next slide, please. So kind of jumping to the end, but if you're advocating for something, what are some of the outcomes that you could see from that work? So it could bring greater visibility and knowledge to the issues you're advocating for. You could see media coverage. You could develop new allies and champions on a particular topic or issue. Advocacy could lead to the change in people's beliefs or attitudes. It could garner the political will to do something. You could see increased funding, and advocacy could lead to a change in laws, regulations, policies, legislation, or planning. So that's kind of some of the outcomes. Next slide. So if you were going to jot something down and you have your notepad in front of you, this is, in a nutshell, a quick overview of how you could build an advocacy strategy. We could spend, hours just on this and really go into detail. So I'll just go through them quickly, and yeah, definitely jot down any questions that you can ask us at the end. But if you want to advocate for something, first you need to identify the issue. So what's important to you? What's the problem that you want to solve? Next, you would educate yourself. Oh, sorry, not the next slide, Sabina. Next up on the list, thanks. Number 2 is educating yourself. So you want to make sure that you have the latest facts, figures, and information. Reach out to experts and know everything you can about this topic. Number 3 would be identifying targets and stakeholders. We'll have more on this in a minute. So the people who should be involved in this discussion. You need to set SMART. You're all university students. I hope you know what SMART goals are. We'll also come back to this. Set some SMART goals and objectives for yourself. develop the strategy, the tactics you want to use for advocating. You should create some compelling key messages. So it doesn't have to be paragraphs and paragraphs, but those really short, sweet, important facts that you need to have. Next, you would build a movement. So bringing in supporters, allies, people with lived experience to your cause. You would want to plan to monitor and evaluate your progress so that you can check up on those goals and see if you need to change gears. And then plan for accountability. So if you're asking someone, say the government, to do something, you want to make sure that you hold them accountable. Next slide. So if out of all of that, there was one thing that is the most important, it really would be the ask. And we talk about this a lot at our work at Results, but what is the ask? What are we asking people to do? So to think through that, you would go who, so which decision maker or stakeholder has to take action. What is the action that they should take? What do you want them to do? What is the time frame for them to take that action, and why? Why is writing this letter? Why is doing something important to achieving your ultimate goal? And there's your reminder of the SMART goals there: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timed or timely. Thanks. Next slide. So the targets, I said we'd come back to this. So there's important players who should be involved, and who are you targeting with your advocacy? So there's a difference between decision makers and influencers. You can see some examples up on the screen. Decision makers are those people who hold power, you know, maybe elected officials, your member of parliament, the prime minister himself. Influencers could be celebrities, public figures, and decision makers can be effective influencers, but these are kind of different types of targets. Next slide. Then there's also the tactics. So you've got this plan, you've got this goal, you've got this idea, you know who you want to talk to, but how do you actually advocate? What are you actually doing to cause this change and this education? So to get that message, the important ask across to the decision makers or influencers, what should you do? So some of the ways, and I mean these are limitless, but some of the ways you could do this are through meetings with decision makers. So you could call your member of parliament for a meeting, could write an op-ed, a letter to the editor, get articles out to the media, do lots of social media outreach. You can hold workshops and conferences about the issues. You could write position papers or briefing documents and hold stunts. So kind of getting this interest around a particular topic. So these are the tactics, some of the strategies that you might use in your advocacy. I believe that's my last slide. Can we see the next one? Thanks. So I'll hand it over to Lindsay.
So hello everyone, my name is Lindsay Sheridan and I'm the Parliamentary Officer at Results Canada, and so this essentially means that I handle all the parliamentary engagement and strategy along with the team. And one of the things I also want to just make clear right from the get-go is that advocacy can be a very small change you're trying to achieve, or it can be something big that you're trying to achieve. It doesn't really have a limit, and it exists on a spectrum. So even if you're just trying to, let's say, get the garbage or a new recycling program in your community, that you can advocate towards reaching that goal. And so we can go to the next slide. And so I just wanted to do a quick recap. When we're talking about parliamentary advocacy specifically, we're looking at conducting actions aimed to influence elected officials to bring about specific changes. And something that's important to remember here is that when you're trying to think of your issue or your ultimate goal, you want to make sure that you're reaching and causing influence in the right level of government. So you need to do a little bit of homework beforehand and see if the municipal, provincial, or federal government is going to be the best way forward. In the advocacy that I do, because the federal government has the mandate and jurisdiction for international matters, I usually deal exclusively within the federal space. So we can go to the next slide. So we're actually living in a really interesting time right now in regards to Parliament in Canada. First off, the pandemic has forced us to do this very interesting hybrid session. So we have a different amount of people in the House of Commons. We have members for the first time voting from home using technology and attending committees at home. So it's really created an interesting dynamic within the House of Commons. The other really exciting thing that's happening right now is Canada is currently in a minority government, which means that the Liberals have the most seats in the House of Commons, but they don't hold a majority. And so majority number of seats is just under 170. So this is really critical because this means that if the Liberals want to pass any legislation or create new bills, they do need to get the support of another party in the House of Commons. And this creates a really unique dynamic because it means that there's room for negotiation, there's much more communication, and other parties can get concessions in some of the new bills and laws that are passed. This also means that if the Liberals bring something to the House of Commons, if all the opposition parties come together, they can kill kind of the Liberal bills that are engaged. And so I think that's something really important in advocacy because there is a lot more communication happening. So there is a lot more opportunities. The other thing I just want to mention before we move forward, and it's something that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that when you're doing advocacy, it's really important to do your historical homework on all of the parties. I know we all have different experiences, biases, and opinions based on some of the platforms, but in my own experience, I want to say that it's really interesting where unusual suspects might lie, and you might be in a situation where a member of the party might not agree with the leader or even the policy that the party is articulating. So it's really important not to limit yourself within party lines when you're doing advocacy, and that you try to remain nonpartisan because you never know where you're going to find allies and champions within the House of Commons. We can go to the next slide. So I love a terrible picture collage, and as you can see here, we have some really interesting photos. Right here at the, I think, top left, we have a Green MP Paul Manley. He's behind a green screen. He's talking on his phone while simultaneously listening to headphones. We have NDP MP Daniel Blakey in the top right corner. He's just put a sheet behind him. And then my personal favorite at the bottom, we have Science and Innovation Minister Navdeep Bains. And then some of these other photos represent some of the volunteer meetings our network has had with MPs. And one of the things I want to explain with you today, when you're talking about communicating, we are unfortunately been forced, because of the pandemic, this global crisis, to exist in little boxes in our communication. And so when we're talking about parliamentarian engagement in the context of today, I really wanted to chat with everybody today about how to communicate effectively. So we can go to the next slide. And so these are just some pro tips for effective communication whenever you're starting any engagement with any elected officials. Now, I primarily deal with members of parliament and senators, but this doesn't mean you can't use these tactics and these ideas when you're advocating in the municipal or provincial government as well. And so just quickly, first off, these are some really important ways to communicate on the sides. You can write a letter, and whenever you're writing a letter to an MP, postal is free, so make sure you keep that in mind. A lot of people actually don't know that. You can send their office an email, give them a quick phone call. You can tag them on social media, which can get a lot of attention. You can attend virtual events like town halls. A lot of MPs are trying to be really dynamic now online, so they're trying to host new virtual events, and so that's a way you can kind of make this touch point and introduce yourself. You can try to schedule a meeting, or you can write a letter to the editor where you call out your MP. The MP's offices track where their names exist in media, so there's a good chance your MP will read your LTE if you include their name in it. And so whenever I'm starting any type of strategy with any of the different, I guess, goals or asks that Results Canada deals with, I tend to use these tips for effective communication and kind of tend to build my strategy off of this. So the first thing I want everybody to think of when you're trying to make change, be it in your community or something even globally, is you want to identify your parliamentary goal, because this might be different from your overall goal. Parliament is a little bit different, it's separate, there's different procedures, there's different ways to go about things. And so you want to identify what your parliamentary goal is. What are you trying to achieve by engaging with elected officials, with politicians? After you've kind of landed on that, you want to map your targets. So who is going to be the best, either an influencer, or who is going to be the best to kind of make change in the area you want? Maybe you're going to go straight to the minister and say, this is what I want. Maybe you're going to use the opposition to put pressure on the minister's office or on the government. Or maybe you're just going to advocate within your own member of parliament in your riding and community and try to get up the ladder from there. And so once you've mapped your targets, it's really, really critical to do your research. And there's a couple of things that I want to share with you all that is really important when you're starting to do research on your MP. First, traditionally go to their home bio, so their actual webpage, and you can kind of see like if they volunteered, they usually put that information in, if they're a board of director, what their career was before. And this really helps you get an understanding of what they're involved in or have been interested in the past. Next, I always like to creep their social media. I check out their Twitter and their Facebook and see if they've posted anything drastic or dramatic or anything that links to the issues or anything that also might oppose the issues, because you want to know ahead of time when you're engaging if the person you're talking to is not going to be on board. And then finally, something that's a little bit unorthodox is I also like to look at their Wikipedia page, because the Wikipedia page often tends to have any controversies that the MP might have been involved in. And so obviously they're not going to post this on their home web page. So if there are any controversies, they usually do show up on Wikipedia. And then finally, I usually just type their name in and do a news search to see if their name has popped up in any different news articles. And so the reason why research is so important is because your research is going to help frame your messaging. So when you're messaging, you need to kind of think of what is going to be the most persuasive argument you can present to a politician, to an MP, to a senator. And this is really critical because different arguments will have more sway than others depending on the person. Everybody has their own experiences, and MPs are normal people, so they will be moved by different things. And so you want to make sure you're framing your messaging around an argument that will make sense, be it economic, be it scientific, maybe they are really into the compassionate side. You need to have an idea of that before you start engaging. And then something that Results Canada, all of the different advocacy organizations of Results have coined and used to do effective communication is something that we call the EPIC model. So we can go to the next slide. And so the EPIC model is really important, and this model can be used when you're writing an LTE, when you're on the phone, when you're writing an email or a letter. It's really important because it kind of provides you an outline on the important things that you should be hitting when you're talking to basically even any kind of change maker, decision maker. It can be outside of politics as well. And this is really critical, especially with MPs, because you might only have one opportunity to engage with them. Everybody's really busy, and so you really need to make that time really, really effective. And so I just want to quickly go over this with you all, because I think it's really important, not only within advocacy, but just as a way when you're communicating. So whenever you have a problem, the first thing you want to do is engage. So you want to grab your listeners' attention. You want to bring them in, you want them to be involved in the conversation, and you want to do this by either giving a dramatic fact, a short statement that is really moving, or a story that you find is really inspiring. So you really want to pull them into the conversation. You want them to know where you're headed. You want them to be very engaged in what you're about to talk about. After you've done that, you want to state the problem. So you want to explain and elaborate on what the problem is. Whenever you're working or dealing with members of parliament, I always say that it's really important to put that personal side in as well, because the personal is what the members of parliament are going to remember, and they're going to hold on to that. And so when you're explaining the problem, I always say it's really important to include why that problem matters to you as an individual. And so you want to use facts, statistics, and you want to use specific examples and details and describe how widespread it is so that they really understand the breadth of the problem that you're trying to solve. After you've engaged and stated the problem, you're going to inform them by providing a solution to the problem. So you're going to say, listen, I just gave you that problem and it's a big issue, but guess what? I do have a solution for you. And this is where you're going to describe, if you can, how, where, and when it's worked. You can outline how it's proven to be cost effective. If there is data, you can highlight the cost of inaction. And then you can explain how this is going to be a high impact solution. And so when we're talking about this, I think one of the ways, like a great example of how you're going to inform our solution would be vaccines. When we're talking about the success of vaccines, it's very obvious to plot some of this data as vaccines as a solution. So after you've engaged, you stated the problem, you've provided the solution, arguably the most important step is going to be what we like to call the call to action. And this is where you're going to ask the listener to do something and get them to do something that will solve your problem. So you're going to ask them to take action. And when you're asking them, you want to make sure that it's whatever you're asking is very specific and concrete, and you're going to present it in a yes or no statement. So it's very obvious whether or not the decision maker or MP has said, yes, I will do this for you, or no. You want it to be very clear that they will be taking action. And then you want to build in that accountability piece. You're going to let them know that, hey, you've said you're going to take this action. I will follow up with you next week to see if you've done it. And so one of the examples of an action that we asked MPs to do when we were advocating for more funding towards the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was we were asking members of Parliament to send a letter of support to the Prime Minister that said, I support funding towards the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. So in meetings, I would say, will you send this letter to the Prime Minister? And then they would say yes or no. And then I would follow up and ask them to send me a copy of this letter. And this was an important tactic because we used it across party lines, which was important, so that these letters were coming to the Prime Minister from all the different parties, which shows the Prime Minister, one, there is multi-party support, which means an announcement will not be controversial. It won't drum up a lot of drama. And two, it also kind of helps create momentum. So we have all these different members of Parliament from different areas across the political spectrum saying that they support this cause. And so that was something that was successful that we did. And so I really hope that you all try to at least think or frame some of your actions or ideas using this EPIC model, because it can be really helpful when you're organizing your thoughts and kind of creating an outline if you do ever have a meeting with your MP. So we can go to the next slide. And so finally, some things to remember. Elected officials, they work for you. And this is something that's so critical. I think a lot of times people think that engaging with MPs or getting involved in politics can be really daunting, but I want to reiterate how crucial the relationship building aspect of it is. Right now, especially in a minority government, MPs are very involved in constituent life and work because there could be an election within the next year. And so they want to make sure that they're trying to please as many people as they can. And so they do work for you. You do have power in that relationship. And I urge you all to try to grab that power and use it for positive change, which is what Results Canada tries to do. Number two, you don't need to know all the answers. You're not expected to know all the answers. A lot of times people are advocating because it's something they're passionate about, while also doing their other job or being in school. And so if you don't know the answer when you're ever in an engagement, just let them know. Just say, hey, I don't happen to know that answer. I'll get back to you in an email after this. And then finally, any single action is the starting point. I think we're really lucky in Canada to live in a democracy where we do have the opportunity to engage. And I think it's really important that as young people too, we are engaging with our members of Parliament. We are having our passions known. We are trying to activate the change we want to see. We're really trying to get engaged. And I think it's really important that we start doing this in, I guess, higher volumes. So any action is a starting point, whether it's following your MP on Twitter or signing up for a newsletter, or even just sending it an email saying, hi, this is my name, I live in your riding, this is what I care about. And so I know it can be daunting engaging in politics, but it's really important aspect of making change in advocacy. And I hope that you all at least take from this an understanding how vital it is to make change. And then I'll pass it over to our Executive Director, Chris Dendys, to explain a really cool global coalition that we've been advocating for within the global health space.
Thanks, Lindsay. Just next slide, please, Sabina. I think I'm biased, but those were great presentations, Amelia and Lindsay, so deeply appreciated. I'm gonna now take over and make it a little bit real. So we've been talking a bit about theory. We've been talking about, you know, various models of advocacy, or the kind of the lessons related to advocacy. And again, shoving this into a short timeline. So at the end, I'll tell you how you can get more engaged with us in advocacy over the longer term. But I'm going to share a little bit of a case study or a story of a campaign that we've been working on right now. And actually the people on this call have been really leading the charge on this. So it is related to COVID, so it's quite timely. We've been very engaged in you know, what is obviously one of the biggest global health challenges in recent modern times, recent history, well, over the last century, and the impacts have been devastating, as we all know, we're living it, hence us even being virtually connected right now. But so I'm going to talk to you about ACT, the ACT Accelerator, and ACT stands for Access to COVID Tools. It's next slide, please, Sabina. So the ACT Accelerator has been billed as, I mean, I suppose the best way to kind of frame it is a COVID exit strategy. So it's the medical approaches. We all know that COVID is having massive impacts in terms of the collateral damage associated with it in relation to immunizations, protocols that have been broken, in relation to malnutrition and hunger, in relation to lack of access to education. There's a lot of collateral damage related to COVID that is extreme and massive in terms of economic impact and also global health tertiary impacts. But this ACT Accelerator is meant to actually address the disease itself. And it's basically designed, sort of affiliated and housed at the WHO, but it's designed under a number of different pillars to try to get at COVID. There's 4 pillars: the vaccines pillars, the therapeutics pillar, and the diagnostics pillar, and also a health systems connector. And within each of these pillars, there's a lead organization that's kind of managing the investment case and the plan forward to address, again, the emergency sort of implications of COVID. So it is, as it says on the slide, a groundbreaking global collaboration to accelerate the development, production, and equitable access, equitable being key, and we'll get to that in a minute, to COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines. Next slide, please. And this slide is just indicating that what's really interesting and why it's a coalition and not a new mechanism, but a coalition, is that the partners engaged in each of these pillars are proven multilateral institutions that have a real, a strong track record in terms of global health. Since many of you, or all of you, are involved in global health, you'll have heard of many of these organizations. Gavi, the Global Vaccines Alliance, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. The World Bank obviously is engaged. FIND, which is working on diagnostics and testing, the WHO. So I wanted to articulate that because the way that the funding is flowing to the ACT Accelerator, this coalition, are through these various partners. So it makes the advocacy interesting, but also important. Next slide, please. So going back to, actually, can we go back one? Sorry. So going back to what we've learned and what we've talked about already in this session in terms of establishing SMART goals and objectives and identifying what the challenge is, we know what the challenge is. The challenge is COVID. So this was developed with these global partners as a response to that challenge. And so this is the solution. So a number of months ago, results came together, I'd say back in, as early as April or May, with a few partners in the sector, particularly one in Global Citizen. So results, one in Global Citizen in Canada came together and really identified that this would be the solution and that Canada should be doing more to end COVID globally. So end COVID everywhere, not just a Canadian response, but a global response. And so we came together and we thought we did our research. We knew that this was an answer to the problem, and we thought about resource mobilization for this. And then we thought about how could we frame a resource mobilization ask around this. And this is before the investment case actually completely came out, but nevertheless, we knew that we were looking at the investment case being around $38 billion, which I'll speak to again in a minute in terms of a notion of need and what that really represents in the world. But nevertheless, we looked at what Canada was spending domestically, which at the time was about 200 billion? In any event, we looked at what Canada was spending on a domestic response to COVID, and we came up with this notion of a 1% ask. Next slide, please. And what I mean by 1% is that quite simply put, that we came up with the idea that Canada, to reach a fair share, should invest at least 1% of what we're spending domestically, which seems pretty reasonable, on a global COVID emergency response. And that at the time, it's a fluctuating figure because it's a percentage of what we're spending, but at the time it worked out to about $2 billion. $2 billion to a global COVID response, which would be new and additional to the international development envelope. So we had our ask. Canada should invest in a global COVID response. We should lead on it. We should stand up for multilateralism, and we should invest at least $2 billion in a global COVID response. Part of that resource should go to the Accelerator, which I just talked to you about. Part of it should go to some of the collateral damage and the tertiary impacts. So what we did was we started a campaign, the 1% campaign, and we all galvanized our volunteers. And, you know, I think we spoke to this. There's ways of doing advocacy. We call it outside and inside, external or internal. So the external, the outside advocacy is about involving grassroots. It's about having an ask defined. It's about getting grassroots involved. It's about social media. It's about publications, about letter to the editors. It's getting it out into the universe of political discourse and having those conversations and really galvanizing volunteers to kind of take action. So you can see on this slide that there was a number of things that we undertook, you know, whether it was social media graphics, you know, defining the ask to make it sort of simple and tight, you know, a variety. You can see there was meetings that our volunteers had with parliamentarians, and in this case, a cabinet minister, that's Catherine McKenna, and a social media campaign. So over the course of months, hundreds of letters to the editor were published or sent. You know, there was a lot of action that was taking place. And next slide, please. And additionally, while we were doing this external sort of outward facing advocacy, we were galvanizing the community that was internal. So the international development community in Canada, you know, that through a lot of meetings and through discussions and bringing coalitions together, 90 international development organizations came together and signed on to this 1% ask. So now we had a whole coalition, a chorus of voices calling for this, meeting with decision makers, meeting with the ministers, writing to the Prime Minister. A letter was signed by these 90 organizations and sent to Trudeau. So we're trying to build the political will, and that's what Results is all about, as we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation, to create big change in the world. We defined our ask, this 1% ask. You know, we met with parliamentarians. We've done all of the things and the tactics that have been articulated throughout the course of this presentation. And we still are, by the way, because I'll say where we've come to, but one of the things that's on this slide is that we carry forward. And in fact, Results is leading and coordinating a briefing of parliamentarians. You can see on the bottom right of this slide, Peter Sands, who's the Executive Director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and the Chief Scientist of the WHO. We're bringing them together, and we're doing a parliamentary briefing on October 30th. So I think that's in a couple of weeks, to inform parliamentarians and their staffers about the Accelerator, to talk about it as the COVID exit strategy, to educate them so that as, you know, this ask gets even more uptake, that they're supportive across party lines. So again, that's just another tactic, but all of this inside, outside, internal, external advocacy has been ongoing for months. Next slide, please. And it's bearing results. And I think that's the most important thing to articulate, is that as recently as a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister announced investment in the vaccine pillar of ACT-A, you know, $440 million. To date, with the resources that Canada has invested globally, about 1.1 billion, remember we had that 2 billion ask? Canada's invested about $1.1 billion in a global COVID response. And I'm happy to note that 740 million, Robin will correct me if I'm wrong, 700, thumbs up, 740 million of that is new and additional to the international aid envelope. I mean, I think that's a significant accomplishment. We're not done. We're only 40% of the way there, but we're moving in the right direction. And that's because a bunch of people who cared and recognized that there was a problem and there was a solution at hand came together and I think undertook really effective advocacy and continues to take that advocacy or undertake the, you know, the tactics and the efforts to really change the world. And as you can see, sometimes advocacy bears results. And in fact, it often does. So wanted to share this example with you because I think it's an exciting one in terms of we're in the midst of this campaign now and we're still carrying forward. But you can see over the course of months how change can happen. Next slide, please. And as I said, we're not done yet. So to put things in perspective, and this is where I want to engage all of you in the advocacy that we're undertaking, our End COVID Everywhere campaign, as I said, is about 40% of the way that it needs to go. What you're seeing on the screen is the global investment case, what the world has said with all of the pillars is necessary, not over the long term, frankly, but over the short term, short to medium term, to ensure an equitable global response to COVID. And we're talking about, a $35 billion gap globally still. And I want to speak to that for a minute. As you can see, our Canadian ask is Canadian specific. It's the 2 billion, and of which we're about, 40% there. But the global ask, what the pushback that we get, and this is where research really matters, and we're being able to articulate the case matters, is that feels like a lot. I mean, it is. It's a significantly huge amount of money. But as one of my global health heroes, Paul Farmer of Partners in Health, has said, we are socialized to accept scarcity. And when you put it in perspective, with the $12 trillion loss annually that COVID is reaping in terms of economic costs because of the impact on the economy, this amount of resources could be regained and recouped in 36 hours. So we need to put it in perspective that for once, actually, in an overt way, we all know as global health advocates and professionals that global health has a massive impact in terms of economics, equity, all of those pieces. COVID has actually made that case glaringly accurate. And so we will continue to advocate for these resources from the Canadian perspective, but also working from a grassroots to global, venue in terms of working with global advocates as well, who I will say and add, and Robin will want me to do this because we're proud of this, that Canada started with that 1% ask, that we came together around that 1% ask to be able to explain it. And now that has been taken on by the WHO and donor markets around the world in terms of pushing their own governments. So sometimes a good idea has global traction. Next slide, please. So some final thoughts. There's strength in numbers. There's strength in diversity of voices. There's strength in a sense of both an inside activist and advocacy sort of strategy and an outside one. You don't have to work for an advocacy organization to undertake advocacy. Every individual can undertake that. Everybody on this call can be a participant in the solutions that we want to achieve. It's really important to have a clear ask and be prepared. As Lindsay and Amelia both went through, there's prep in advocacy, but speaking out and taking action is really what matters. And so do all the prep, think about what you want to achieve. But really the most important thing, and this is what RESULT stands for, is that education without action can be a road to hopelessness. If you just know about the extent of the challenge and the problem, you can kind of wallow in despair. Taking action, pressing send on an email to a decision maker, picking up the phone and calling a parliamentarian, participating in conferences like this where you're learning, and then most importantly, doing something is incredibly important. And, there are times when, even now having been involved in this work for many, many years, you're all young professionals, I'm an old one, I get nervous. I get nervous when I have to speak. I'm a bit nervous right now. And, I heard this woman speak one time and she really stayed with me. She said that sometimes, when you push yourself to be bold, you can feel your heart racing in your chest, like an emblem of fear. One way to look at it is an emblem of fear. The other way is inner applause. And so at RESULTS, what we try to do is train people to kind of hear that emblem of fear as inner applause and push them and push you and push all of us to kind of do better, to take action, to make a difference in the world because the stakes are high and because your voice matters. So next slide, please. So now we want you to kind of take all of this and do exactly what I was just speaking about, which is take action. Interestingly enough, I think it's kismet that today is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. The International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, where everybody comes together around the world and says, this is not acceptable. Extreme poverty, anyone living in extreme poverty is not acceptable. And as we know, the as we know, things are actually getting a little bit worse rather than better. We have the potential to be turning back progress rather than kind of continuing to map it. And so we'd love you to take action right now. So many of you are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You'll see in the chat box, I'm sure Amelia is putting some stuff in there, but this is a sample tweet. Pick up your phones, please, right now. Copy and paste that into your Twitter feed or your own, use your own voice. The other thing about results is typically when people are educated, we want you to speak with your own voice because that's where the big change, transformation of individuals, but also the world is going to happen. But please, everybody take this out right now, and if we all tweet at the same time, we can really kind of add our voices to a bigger chorus. Next slide, we're almost done. And also just want to encourage you, we have our own virtual conference that's coming up. It's also free, it's a free online event. I'm sure this team will put the registration code in the chat box again, or we can follow up with it perhaps when this is available. But it's 2 days, November 14th and 15th. It is a series of advocacy workshops like this that go a little bit deeper over the course of the 2 days, coupled with hearing from experts. Actually, our keynote speaker is Nobel Prize winner Mohammed Yunus, who is the founder of the Grameen Bank and microfinance, but is also, now really about COVID equity and the response being equitable globally. And so we'd encourage you to participate in that. And we'd love you to join us. Next slide. And beyond that, just thank you. If you want to get involved with results, you can just look at our website. We have many sort of ways to kind of join up, become a volunteer with us. I know there are volunteers that are actually even at this boot camp like Nina and others. But thank you for your time. And if there are any questions in the last few minutes before we wrap, we're happy to kind of entertain those. Thanks.
Amelia, Lindsay, Chris, and Robin, thank you so much for your inspirational words. I hope everyone joins me in feeling extremely motivated to leverage our individual power to mobilize some change. Like was mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll open them up for a short Q&A session.
Sure. Shall I just go ahead?
Sure. No, go ahead.
I just see there's one question about where you came up with the 1% of domestic product. So it's 1% of, the 1% came from what Canada was investing already in Canada on the COVID response. And we got the information related to the overall spend for Canada from the Parliamentary Budget Office. And the 1% was really just sort of coming together and knowing we had a bit of a heads up because we'd done our research and we were connected to a variety of, global players at WHO. We knew that the ask for the Accelerator at minimum was going to be around the 38 billion sort of range. And really just kind of did the math backwards and sort of assumed what our fair share might be based on like OECD sort of stats and typically what Canada's fair share would be. And really just kind of came up with that 1% as a reasonable ask that also was easy to sell. And when we got pushback saying we should be spending everything in Canada, well, 1% of what Canada is spending on a global response felt like it was reasonable and achievable. Remember the SMART goals about being achievable. I don't see any other.
Chris, I see another question.
Can you explain
Could you explain the difference? Yeah.
Between supporters, allies, and partners? Does anybody else want to, Lindsay or Amelia? Or Robin, supporters, allies, and partners?
So I can jump in. So I think a supporter is anybody who's kind of on board, who agrees with the cause you're saying, who has taken action, and who is overall supportive of what you have been engaged on. When we're talking about allies, I would say that these are people who are also in the same space, who are working within the same goals, who are also then I guess engaged, and they're not only supportive, but they're also, I guess you could say, amplifying. And then finally, partners are people who you're working alongside. We've been working with other organizations with this 1% ask, and so they would be partners in terms of doing outreach, in terms of doing the advocacy. And so also allies, you can think of allies. Allies might also be, let's say, the World Health Organization. I would consider it an ally because they have been showing support. And then a supporter could be our grassroots. So they're also taking and using their own individual power to build momentum. But Robin or Amelia, if you want to add anything else, please jump in.
When somebody just nails it off the bat and there's nothing to add, Lindsay. It's such a great response.
Well, thank you. Listen, thank you, everybody. I think we're at a point where we need to close and pass it back to Sabina for some notes. But just reach out to us. You can reach us through our website. As I said, you can join results. You can participate in our national conference. Follow us on Twitter. Retweet. That's an action as well. And most importantly, just kind of keep doing what you're doing, which is being engaged, thoughtful, and powerful citizens. You are really influencers, and so we just are trying to encourage you to use that influential role and that voice to really make a difference in the world. So thank you so much for participating in this session. It's been a gas. Thanks.
There is one.
So thank you so much,
Chris.
Question. Oh, yeah.
So I just want to say that results, and it's my wonderful colleagues, but it's much more than just us here on the screen. We actually have a passionate grassroots network that's just made of individual Canadian citizens from across Canada who are just really passionate about creating a world free from extreme poverty. And so when we're creating an ask like this 1% ask, it does need to sit well with the grassroots. They do need to understand it. They need to be able to communicate it. They need to be able to see that it makes sense to them. And so one of the ways that we're able to kind of make sure that it fits within the Canadian space is by reaching out to our grassroots and making sure it aligns with what they also are experiencing, and if it's something that they can kind of get on board with. And so the 1%, as Chris articulated earlier, we're hoping that part of that will go to the ACT Accelerator, and then that part of it will go to the collateral effects that COVID has created, including the education crisis, malnutrition rates, food insecurity, and just a lot of other pieces that are really important that are kind of the knock-off effects of what COVID has created. So I hope that answers the question. I think that's all the time we have now.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that we also, our ask has been sense checked, and other partners in working in international development and global health have come on board to it too. So Chris mentioned that Cooperation Canada's membership are advocating around the 1% ask too. So there's 90 plus sector organizations all rallying behind the exact same ask.
Okay, so for the sake of time, we are going to wrap up our Q&A, but I'm sure, correct me if I'm wrong, results team, are they free to email the email address that you have right here on the slide if they have any more questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm getting a round of nods. Perfect. So if you do have any more outstanding questions, please feel free to connect via that email address on the slide. But just to wrap up the conversation, my lovely colleague Dan has linked our Facebook group. Please use that Facebook group to continue connecting with each other and motivating one another to mobilize some change. And with that, we will be wrapping up this session, but we hope to see you throughout the day today, and especially at our keynote speakers later today. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.